They called me the King of Hollywood. A poll of the American public in 1937 gave me that title, and MGM built a throne out of it, and I sat in it for 20 years. Here is what the king actually was. A man from Cadiz, Ohio, with ears too big for leading man roles, and a gum infection so severe in 1933 that they pulled most of his teeth and replaced them with dentures that gave him breath foul enough that Vivien Leigh complained about it every day on the Gone with the Wind set. The King of Hollywood had false teeth and bad breath. Everything you thought you knew about me was manufactured. I'd like to tell you what was real. The teeth went first. In 1933, during the filming of Dancing Lady, a gum infection called pyorrhea destroyed most of my teeth, and they were replaced with dentures that caused a halitosis severe enough that Vivien Leigh complained about it every day on the set of Gone with the Wind. The most romantic film ever made. The staircase, the field, a co-star breathing through her mouth. Nobody printed that. Howard Strickling, MGM's publicity chief, made sure nobody printed that. That is where this story begins. Not with the title, not with Rhett Butler, not with the poster, but with the gap between what the image required and what the man underneath it actually was. My name is Clark Gable. I was called the King of Hollywood. A poll of the American public gave me that title in 1937, and MGM built a throne out of it, and I sat in it for 20 years. Here is what the king actually was. A man from Ohio, with ears too large for leading man roles, a manufactured voice and posture, a manufactured image, and a daughter whose ears were surgically altered at age 7 so she would look less like him. I met that daughter once. She was 15. I kissed her on the forehead and left, and never went back. When I died in November 1960, she wanted to come to my funeral and did not, because I had spent 25 years making sure the door had no handle on her side. Between the teeth and the daughter is everything else. Carol, who was real, who called me Pa, who died on a Nevada mountain in January 1942, coming home to surprise me. The war, which I went to with a death wish and flew 5 bombing missions over Germany at 41 years old, because there was nothing left in Hollywood worth being. Rhett Butler, who I played with false teeth while Vivien Leigh suffered. 23 years at MGM, producing pictures whose commercial success depended entirely on a name and an image that a studio publicity chief had built from a shy boy from Cadiz, Ohio. This king stuff is pure bullshit. I said that once. Nobody printed it. I want it printed now. Let me start with the ears, because the ears are where this particular story of image and reality begins, and because they are the detail that almost ended everything before it started. I was born William Clark Gable in Cadiz, Ohio on February 1st, 1901. My mother died when I was an infant, the first loss, the one that set the pattern. My father was an oil driller who remarried and moved the family through a series of Ohio towns while I grew up trying to figure out what I was for. I dropped out of high school at 16. I worked in a tire factory in Akron. One evening, I wandered into a theater and watched a play, and something happened that I could not precisely name at 16, but that I now understand was simply recognition. The recognition that what those people doing on that stage was what I was supposed to be doing, and that everything before that moment had been waiting for this particular understanding to arrive. The ears were the problem. I made my way to Hollywood in my 20s, and the screen tests confirmed what the casting agents told me directly. My ears were too large for a leading man. The physical fact of my face, which the camera would later transform into something called rugged masculinity, was initially disqualifying. I went back to the stage, worked my way through productions in Portland and New York, developed under the tutelage of a woman named Josephine Dillon, who became my first wife, and who was 17 years older than me, and who understood before I did that the raw material of what I was needed significant processing before it would be suitable for public consumption. She lowered my voice. She corrected my posture. She taught me to carry myself in the specific way that the word masculine would later be attached to, as if it were natural, as if it were simply who I was, rather than something a woman 20 years my senior had spent years constructing out of a shy boy from Ohio who couldn't get a screen test because his ears stuck out. MGM signed me in December 1930, and the process that Josephine had begun accelerated into an industrial operation. Howard Strickling, MGM's publicity chief, took the raw material and built the image with the specific efficiency of someone who understood that what the public needed was not a person, but a type. The virile American male, the man's man, and the woman's ideal, the rough charm and the easy confidence that women wanted and men wanted to be. He built it from me. The ears were eventually accepted. The audience decided, with the specific illogic of audiences, that the ears were part of the charm. The image was complete by the mid-1930s, and underneath the king, quietly, a gum infection was destroying my teeth. During the filming of Dancing Lady in 1933, pyorrhea, an advanced gum infection, spread through my mouth and into my body, reaching my gallbladder and hospitalizing me. When I emerged, most of my teeth were gone. They were replaced by dentures. The dentures caused halitosis severe enough that Vivien Leigh complained about it every day on the set of Gone with the Wind. The most romantic film ever made, the scene on the staircase, the scene in the field, was filmed by an actor whose co-star was breathing through her mouth to avoid his breath. Nobody printed that. Howard Strickling made sure nobody printed that. That is the precise description of how the image worked. In 1935, I was sent by MGM to make a film called Call of the Wild, an adaptation of Jack London, filmed partly on location in the mountains of Washington State. Loretta Young was my co-star. She was 22 years old, devoutly Catholic, unmarried, and extraordinarily beautiful. I was 34, and married to my second wife, Rhea Langham, a Texas socialite considerably older than me, whose money had helped sustain my early career, and whose marriage to me had become, by 1935, a business arrangement, with the warmth extracted. What happened between Loretta and me on that production has been described in various ways by various people in the decades since, and I want to be as precise as I can about what I know and what I don't know, and what the distinction between those two things has cost. I know that something happened between us. I know that 9 months after Call of the Wild wrapped, Loretta gave birth to a daughter she named Judith, after St. Jude, the patron saint of difficult situations. I know that Loretta disappeared from public view during the pregnancy, that she gave Judith to an orphanage within weeks of her birth, that she retrieved her own daughter 19 months later and presented her to the world as an adoption. I know that Judy Lewis grew up looking so precisely like me, the ears, the jaw, the specific architecture of the face, that her mother spent years hiding her behind bonnets, and eventually, when Judy was 7 years old, had a surgeon pin her ears back to reduce the resemblance. A 7-year-old child had surgery to make her look less like her father. That is the specific measure of what the image required. What I don't know, and what I have never been able to resolve, is the precise nature of what happened on that train. Loretta, near the end of her life, told her daughter-in-law Linda that the conception had not been consensual, that I had entered her sleeping car on the overnight train, and that what occurred was not an affair, but something she would eventually, at 85 years old, recognize in a television program about date rape and name for the first time. She said, "That's what happened between me and Clark. I cannot tell you she was wrong. I cannot tell you the version of myself that exists in my memory of that night is reliable. What I can tell you is that a woman spent 65 years unable to name what had happened to her, and that when she finally had the language for it, she used it, and that the daughter who resulted from that night had her ears surgically altered at age 7 so that the man responsible would not be visible in her face. Judy and I met once. She was 15. She had come home from school to find me sitting in her mother's living room. Loretta and I were making another film together, Key to the City, and I had come to visit. Judy and I talked for hours. She was bright and warm, and she had my ears, the real ones, before the surgery had changed them. I kissed her on the forehead when I left. It was the only conversation we ever had. She did not know who I was to her. I knew. I kissed her on the forehead, and I left, and I never went back. Let me tell you about the only thing in my life that was entirely real and entirely mine, and that had nothing to do with Howard Strickling or MGM or the image or the king. Her name was Carole Lombard. She was a screwball comedy actress who swore like a longshoreman and hunted and fished and played practical jokes that were elaborate enough to require advanced planning, and who had, underneath all of that, a quality of absolute directness that I had never encountered in any other person. She said what she thought. She did not manage herself for the room. When she found something funny, she laughed without calculating whether the laugh was becoming. When she was angry, she said so and said why, which was an experience so unfamiliar to me that the first time it happened, I didn't know what to do with my hands. We married in March of 1939, the same month I finished the divorce settlement with Rhea that Gone with the Wind's salary had finally made financially possible. We bought a ranch in Encino, animals, chickens, horses, the specific domesticity of two people who had spent their careers being public and wanted, more than anything, a private life that belonged only to them. She called me Pa. I called her Ma. I want you to understand what those names represented. Not affectation, not a performance of domesticity for the fan magazines, but the specific shorthand of two people who had found in each other the thing they had been looking for, and who had created a language for it that theirs alone. She died on January 16, 1942. She had been on a war bonds tour, Indiana, her home state, where she raised $2 million in a single day, and she was flying back to California to surprise me. The plane crashed into Mount Potosi in Nevada. All 22 people on board were killed. MGM fixer Eddie Mannix called me at the ranch. I was waiting for the phone call from the driver who was supposed to report when Ma landed. Instead, I got Mannix. He said, "King, that's why I'm calling. Carole's plane went down just a few minutes after it left Las Vegas." I asked if I could call him back. I was expecting word on her arrival. He said, "King." I understood. The months that followed are the part of my life I have the least access to, because grief of that magnitude does not store itself in memory the way ordinary experience does. What I know is that I lost 20 pounds. I drank a quart of scotch every day. I ate every meal alone in my trailer on the MGM lot. I had a projector at the ranch, and I watched her films at night, alone, films she had given me the projector to watch. I wore a locket with her hair in it. I went to war, not because the government asked me to. Roosevelt told me to stay where I was. I went because there was nothing left in Hollywood that I could bear to be, and because being shot at seemed, at the time, like a reasonable alternative to being the king of Hollywood, with no Ma to come home to. I enlisted in the Army Air Corps on August 12, 1942, as a private. I was 41 years old, well beyond the draft age, which meant nobody was requiring anything of me, which meant the decision was entirely mine, which was one of the few decisions in my professional life that I can say that about. MGM was against it. Louis B. Mayer was against it. President Roosevelt had already told me no. Howard Strickling was presumably against it because the king of Hollywood becoming a tail gunner on a B-17 over Germany was not an image he had constructed or approved. None of that was the point. The point was that Carole was dead, and I had a death wish, and the war was the only available context in which a death wish was socially acceptable and potentially useful. What I want to tell you about the war is that it changed the terms of the conversation I had been having with myself since 1930 about who I was versus who the image said I was. On the ground in England, at Polebrook with the 351st Bomb Group, nobody cared that I was Clark Gable. The ground crews cared whether I could do my job. The other officers cared whether I was going to get them killed with incompetence. The Germans, who according to military intelligence had been informed of my presence and offered a reward for my capture by Hitler personally, Hitler was reportedly a fan of my films, which is a detail I have never known what to do with. The Germans cared only that I was in a B-17 over their territory. I flew 5 documented combat missions over Germany. I was nearly killed on my 4th mission when a 20mm shell came through the flight deck and passed close enough to where I was sitting that the proximity was the kind that rearranges your relationship to the question of whether your life has been worth something. It had not been, entirely. I knew that. The image had been worth something to MGM and to the audience, and to the culture that needed the King of Hollywood to exist. The man underneath the image had been worth considerably less, had fathered a daughter he never acknowledged, had kissed her on the forehead at 15 and left, and never returned, had built a life of manufactured masculinity that the real thing, the war, the actual danger, threw into relief as precisely the construction it was. I was discharged in June 1944 with the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal, and returned to Hollywood a genuine war hero. The first thing MGM did was figure out how to absorb the genuine heroism into the manufactured image. The King of Hollywood plus war hero. The new slogan for my first post-war film was, "Gable's back and Garson's got him." I found the slogan frivolous. The war had made everything about Hollywood feel frivolous. What I could not put back on, and what nobody at MGM seemed to notice was missing, was the specific quality of not caring what happened to me. I had gone to war with a death wish and come back without one, which sounds like an improvement and is not necessarily. Coming back without a death wish means you have to want something. I had nothing left to want except the image, which was not mine, and the ranch, which was too quiet, and the memory of a woman who called me Pa and laughed without calculating whether the laugh was becoming. Those were the things I came back to. They were not enough, but they were what there was. Gone with the Wind was not my idea. David O. Selznick wanted me desperately. The public wanted me. Polls were conducted, names were submitted, and mine came back with a consistency that Selznick could not ignore. Gary Cooper had already turned the role down, saying Gone with the Wind was going to be the biggest flop in Hollywood history, and that he was glad it would be my nose falling flat rather than his. I read that quote later and appreciated its precision. Cooper was wrong about the flop. He was right that the role was a gamble. What I actually thought about playing Rhett Butler was this. The public had decided I was Rhett Butler before I had read a page of the script. And that pre-decision was the most terrifying thing about the entire production. When the audience arrives at a film already knowing what they expect, the actor's job becomes not performance, but confirmation, the delivery of what was promised, rather than the discovery of something new. I was not delivering Rhett Butler. I was delivering the audience's idea of Rhett Butler, which was the audience's idea of Clark Gable, which was Howard Strickling's construction of Clark Gable, which had started with a shy boy from Ohio with protruding ears being shaped by an acting coach 17 years his senior. The most famous romantic performance in Hollywood history was the end product of a chain of manufactured versions that stretched back to Cadiz, Ohio. Vivian Lee complained about my breath every day. That is documented. She said it, people heard her say it, nobody disputes it. She was not wrong. The dentures that had replaced my real teeth in 1933 produced a specific and persistent halitosis that no amount of preparation could fully eliminate. I was aware of it during every scene, including the famous ones, the staircase, the field, the moments that audiences have watched for 80 years as the definition of cinematic romance. Rhett Butler sweeping Scarlett O'Hara off her feet, the symbol of masculine desire, was a man with false teeth and bad breath, being filmed by a co-star who was, in the precise and documented words that reached the press decades later, suffering through it. The most expensive film ever made to that point, the most romantic film in Hollywood history, constructed on a foundation that included industrial-grade halitosis and a co-star's private suffering. That is the image. That is what the image actually was. The Oscar nomination came. The film made more money than any film had made. The King of Hollywood was confirmed and consolidated, and the title became, after Gone with the Wind, essentially permanent. I said at the time, this King stuff is pure bullshit. Nobody printed that, either. Howard Strickling was very good at his job. After the war, the films kept coming, and the audiences kept coming, and the title kept being applied, and I kept sitting in the chair and putting on the crown, and nothing felt like it had felt before Carol died, because nothing was like it had been before Carol died. MGM gave me pictures: Adventure, Command Decision, Mogambo, Run Silent, Run Deep, and I made them with the professionalism of someone who understood his contractual obligations and had nothing specific against the work and no particular enthusiasm for it either. The audience could feel it. The critics could feel it. The box office began its slow decline from the extraordinary heights of the 1930s toward something more ordinary, more human, more like what happens to men in their 50s who are still doing what they were doing in their 30s, except without the specific quality of believing in it. I left MGM in 1954 after 23 years. The studio system was collapsing under its own weight. The contract players were being released. The machinery that had built and maintained and sustained the King of Hollywood was disassembling itself, piece by piece. And what was left when the machinery stopped was a 53-year-old man in an Encino ranch who owned the title but had no particular use for it. I married again, Lady Sylvia Ashley, who people said looked like Carol, which was true in the superficial sense that she was blonde and glamorous and entirely unlike Carol in every way that mattered. We divorced after 3 years. A screenwriter named Larry Gelbart quoted later that I had refused to go down with a submarine in one film because, in his precise phrasing, Gable doesn't sink. He was not wrong. I had been protecting the image for so long that I had difficulty distinguishing between the image's requirements and my own. I married Kay Williams Spreckles in 1955 and found something approaching stability, something approaching the ordinary dailiness that Carol had given me and that I had spent 13 years looking for. The films in the 1950s were intermittently good and intermittently adequate, and occasionally embarrassing. The image required maintenance regardless of the quality of the material, and I maintained it because the image was the only professional identity available, and because walking away from it would have required knowing what to walk toward, which I did not. The king sat in the chair. The king put on the crown. The king did not sink, even in submarines. In 1959, on November 16th, exactly a year before I would die, Judy Lewis gave birth to a daughter. I became a grandfather without knowing it. I had a granddaughter I would never meet, the child of a daughter I had spoken to once, at 15, when I kissed her on the forehead and left. The King of Hollywood had a granddaughter. The King of Hollywood had false teeth and bad breath, and a death wish that the war had cured, and a daughter whose ears he had caused to be surgically altered, and a granddaughter he would die without acknowledging. That was the inventory. That was what the crown was sitting on. John Huston came to me in 1960 with a script that Arthur Miller had written for Marilyn Monroe. The film was called The Misfits, and it was set in the Nevada desert, and it was about people who no longer fit the world they were living in. Cowboys without cattle drives, men whose skills had outlasted the context that made those skills meaningful. A woman trying to find something real in a landscape of people performing versions of themselves. Miller said later that I was the man who did not know how to hate. He meant it as a compliment. I took it as the most accurate description of my problem anyone had ever offered. The Nevada desert in the summer of 1960 was one of the specific circles of a specific hell. The heat was extraordinary. Marilyn Monroe was in the middle of what would be the last year of her life. The pills, the delays, the hours on set waiting for her to emerge from her trailer, the days when she simply did not come at all. John Huston was drinking. The marriage between Marilyn and Arthur Miller was disintegrating in real time on the set where Miller had written the film as a gift for his wife. I performed my own scenes with the discipline of someone who had been doing this for 30 years. I also did many of my own stunts, wrestling the horses, the physical work that the production required. Because at 59 years old, I was unwilling to be seen to need a younger man to do what the image required me to do. The heart attack came 10 days after filming wrapped, November 6, 1960. I was taken to Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center. The doctors found the damage. I seemed to improve. On the morning of November 16th, I was doing better. That evening, I died of a second heart attack. I was 59 years old. Kay was pregnant with our son, John Clark Gable, who would be born 4 months later, having never met his father. I was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park next to Carol Lombard, which was where I had always intended to be buried, which was the one arrangement I had made that required no image management and no Howard Strickling and no MGM publicity apparatus. Just Pa and Ma, together at Forest Lawn. There is a piece of information I want to give you before we leave this chapter, because it belongs here and not in the conclusion. On the day I died, Judy Lewis, my daughter, the one I had kissed on the forehead at 15 and never spoken to again, wanted to come to my funeral. She did not come. She had no proof, she said, no public acknowledgement, no official confirmation of what she already knew. She stood outside the door of something that should have been hers and could not walk through it because I had spent 25 years making sure the door had no handle on her side. That is the specific cost of the image. Not to me, to her. Here is the inventory without the image on top of it. A man from Cadiz, Ohio, with ears too large for leading man roles, who was shaped into the king of Hollywood by a succession of people. A first wife who rebuilt his voice and his posture. A studio publicity chief who built the image from the raw material. A public that needed the image to exist and confirmed it enthusiastically. False teeth from 1933 onward. Halitosis severe enough that Vivien Leigh documented it daily on the set of the most romantic film ever made. A daughter conceived on a train, or in circumstances that the woman who gave birth to her, 65 years later, recognized as an act she could not consent to. A daughter whose ears were surgically altered at 7 so she would look less like me. A daughter I met once, at 15, kissed on the forehead, and left. A daughter who stood outside my funeral because I had spent 25 years making sure the door had no handle on her side. The thing that was real was Carol. 3 years of marriage, a ranch in Encino, a projector she gave me so I could watch films, a woman who swore and hunted and laughed without calculating whether the laugh was becoming, and who called me Pa, and died on a mountain in Nevada on January 16, 1942, coming home to surprise me. I drank a quart of scotch a day for months. I lost 20 pounds. I went to war with a death wish and flew over Germany in a B-17 and was nearly killed by a 20mm shell that came through the flight deck. and was discharged a genuine war hero with a distinguished flying cross, and came home to an empty ranch and a title that had never felt less relevant. The King of Hollywood without Ma. The phrase does not resolve. It has nowhere to go. What Arthur Miller said about me, that I was the man who did not know how to hate, was the most useful description I ever received, and also the most damning. The man who does not know how to hate cannot resist the system that is building him. He cannot walk out of the meeting with Howard Strickling and say, "The image is a lie, and I will not maintain it." He cannot go back to the set after Call of the Wild and find Loretta and have the conversation that the situation required. He cannot pick up the phone and tell Judy Lewis what she already knew. He accommodates. He cooperates. He performs the version the room requires, and he goes home and he drinks his scotch and he watches Carol's films alone in the dark, and he does not hate anyone for any of it, which means he cannot change any of it, which means the inventory at the end of his life contains a false set of teeth and a dead wife and an unacknowledged daughter and a granddaughter he never met and a title nobody gave him permission to put down. This king stuff is pure bullshit. I said that. Nobody printed it. I want it printed now. So now the teeth are on the record. The daughter is on the record. The death wish and the quart of scotch and the projector and the empty ranch and Carol's films running in the dark are on the record. The specific distance between what the image required and what the man underneath it was, that gap, that lifelong performance of a version of himself that was real enough to sell tickets and false enough that the man saying it knew it was false every day he said it, that is on the record now. I want to leave you with Judy. Not the story I told, not the version where I kissed her on the forehead at 15 and it was a gentle and ambiguous encounter. The version where a girl grew up looking exactly like a man who would never claim her, where her mother had her ears surgically altered at 7 so the resemblance would be less obvious, where her high school friends knew the truth and had been instructed not to tell her, where she stood outside my funeral, unable to walk in because there was no door for her, where she confronted her mother at 31 and her mother said, "You are my sin," where she wrote in her memoir that she had spent her life not being acknowledged by her own parents and did not know what that was like until she had lived it for 60 years, where she died in 2011 having spent her entire life in the shadow of a secret that was never hers to keep. The King of Hollywood could refuse to sink in a submarine scene because the image did not sink. The King of Hollywood could not go back after 1950 and make a different choice about a daughter who had his face and his ears before the surgery changed them. The image outlasted the man by 60 years. Judy Lewis outlasted the image by 11. She deserved a father who could put the crown down long enough to walk through a door and say, "You are mine, and I know it. And I am sorry it took this long to say so." He could not do it. I could not do it. This king stuff is pure bullshit. Share this, and the next time someone hands you a crown, whatever kind of crown it is, ask yourself what it is sitting on. Ask yourself who cannot get through the door on the other side of it. Ask yourself what the inventory looks like when the image is finally removed. It is always more complicated than the poster. It is always more human than the title. And it is always, in the end, the thing that was real that matters. Not the crown, but the ranch in Encino, and Ma coming home, and the projector running in the dark.